As we assess some of these policy proposals we're still getting from the candidates as they take their messages to the swing states with just a handful of days to go at this point until the election. 18?
You act like it's late in the game for this type of thing to be happening.
Well, it kind of
18 days
does feel a little late in the game here. But of course, it's not too late to start putting together some math on this, as we have seen a number of nonpartisan groups do. And we want to get more into the math and potential economic impact of some of these policy proposals and turn now to Ben Harris. He is former Assistant Treasury Secretary during the Biden administration. He's now Brookings Institution Vice President and Director of Economic Studies. He is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Ben, it's good to have you.
Thanks.
If we could just begin with Donald Trump today, suggesting he would at least consider not taxing veterans and first responders and members of the military, some 20 million people layered on top of all of the other tax proposals he's put out there, things that would not get taxed. What is the baseline of how much needs to be taxed to continue to fund the U.S. government?
So more than he's proposing. I mean, I don't have a magic number, but I mean, his approach has been to start with the TCJA extension, which costs $5 trillion over 10 years, and then to add on all of these special tax breaks that really don't have an economic justification. You know, as you just mentioned, tax breaks for wages, for tips, tax breaks for particular occupations, tax breaks for people who receive Social Security benefits, which, by the way, would completely undermine Social Security and Medicare finances. We're already up probably close to around $10 trillion and counting. This isn't a realistic set of proposals. They're just far too expensive to ever make it through Congress.
You know, at one point, Ben, we had Republicans like Kevin Brady, pretty old-fashioned Republicans, sitting here at the table saying, hey, there's going to be a real important debate here. We need to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. That was 6 to 9 months ago, before all the other items and exemptions that we've mentioned since were rolled out. What happens to the old fiscal responsible Republicans who are going to help usher this through on Capitol Hill, who wake up every day to another exemption?
I mean, there are fiscally responsible Republicans in Congress, but they must be pretty lonely right now. I mean, I think the turning point was back in 2017 when Republicans passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut without paying for it. And that kind of opened the door for this idea that, look, for certain types of priorities, it's okay to take on enormous amounts of debt. And so that's what we saw, and that feels like where Donald Trump is left off.
What's the priority now?
What's the priority now? I think the priority is winning the election. And then they'll see the composition of Congress, and then they'll come back to the drawing board. And if there's a Republican sweep, I think you can expect a wholesale extension of the TCJA with a few other Republican priorities mixed in. You know, to be fair to Republicans, though, they did pass the Limit Save Grow Act coming out of the House, which did reduce the deficit. It was basically a combination of caps on discretionary spending plus a couple of other pay-fors. So it's not as though there have been no Republican priorities that have made it through a House of Congress. It just feels like if Donald Trump's going to be in the White House, he's been pretty clear he's comfortable taking on trillions of dollars in new debt.
Ben reminding us that it's not just tax policy that we're going to see a battle over in 2025, but we're going to have to deal with the debt ceiling again, as you recall back to that deal. So there's so much to look forward to. All that to say, when we look at Kamala Harris's proposals, nonpartisan organizations have too said it will add to the deficit, perhaps less. $3.5 trillion is what the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has had to say. But Donald Trump would contend her policies will also be inflationary. Is there not some truth in that?
That her policies would be inflationary?
If she's subsidizing housing, it could drive up housing costs. If she's cutting taxes, all of these things could fuel inflation and make the deficit go higher all the same.
Yeah, so I think on the housing policy, it's great that you brought that up, but the $25,000 first-time homebuyer tax credit was far from the only proposal that she put forward.
Sure.
She also wants to expand housing supply. I think that the first-time homebuyer tax credit really only makes sense if it's done in conjunction with an expansion in the housing supply. That's not really inflationary. As far as her other policies go, I mean, she is taking aim at costs across the board. So she wants to make prescription drugs cheaper. I mean, I think that household costs have been kind of a centerpiece of her policy.
Like price gouging she wants to go after, for example. Does that work?
So, no, I mean, most states have price gouging laws on the books, and for most states, they're non-binding. Most Americans live in a state that has price gouging laws, and as far as I can tell, they're fairly inconsequential. So I think that's, pretty far down on the list of policies that matter for the American people. But she has made prices the centerpiece of her campaign.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that was a big rollout at the time she made it, and it's still on the backdrops, and it's still on the stump speech. It's just when you start weighting priorities, I think, to your point here, will the next president of the United States, Trump or Harris, have to manage a recession in their first year?
That's a great question. I mean, what I can say now about the state of the macroeconomy, this is like the definition of a soft landing. I mean, if we go back 20 years and reflect on what the Fed has done with this current economy, I think we'll kind of be in awe of how well things turned out. I mean, I can just go list some of the highlights. Yeah. We've got a higher share of people working, prime age people working than we've seen in over 20 years. We've seen inflation come down to a level where the Fed is perfectly comfortable with it. We've seen a wealth explosion in this country, almost $50 trillion in wealth added over the course of the pandemic. I mean, you can kind of go on and on and on, but we have a great economy, both relative to prior recoveries and also relative to the rest of the developed world. So right now, when I talk to forecasters, most of them say we have about a 10 to 15% chance of recession in the next year, which is kind of the unconditional average in any year.
Bad.
Right? That's not so bad. Like I'll take that at this point.
Well, so if all of that is how this economy is shaping up right now, does this look like an economy to you that needs easier policy, or is it simply an economy that doesn't need tighter policy anymore?
Are you talking about monetary policy?
Yeah.
Well, I think that with respect to monetary policy, the Fed's at a spot, it's kind of an enviable spot right now, where it knows we're not so close to the neutral rate. The next 50 bips of cutting feel pretty easy. And then you start getting into the hard decisions. So markets right now, I think, are around a 92% chance of a 25 bips cut in the next meeting. I would probably take the over on that as far as probabilities go. And about a 75% chance we'll get 2 cuts between now and December. Those are easy decisions, though. Inflation's way down. The labor market's weakening. I think it's pretty easy to vote for a 25 bips cut. But after we get past the 4.5% for the Fed funds rate, we get closer to 4. That's when the hard decisions start coming.
Donald Trump was asked in the Univision town hall earlier this week, what would happen to agriculture jobs and other parts of the labor market if he followed through on what he calls mass deportation? He didn't use that term in this conversation, but he also didn't really answer the question. Do you have a sense of what would happen to the job market if you shut down the border and conducted a mass deportation of millions of migrants in the country?
Yeah, so these are 2 different policies. So let's separate them out. Right. I mean, so both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump want to shut down the border. Kamala Harris backs the Biden plan, which essentially puts in place a whole host of different policies.
She backs the Senate compromise.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're really talking about now, the difference between the 2 candidates is what would happen if we saw mass deportation on the order of something we've never even come close to seeing in this country. We're talking about potentially immigration agents going to schools, going to places of business, potentially checkpoints. It's really unclear how you're going to find 10 million people to kick them out of the country. From an economic perspective, economists don't love kicking workers out at a time when you have worker shortages. So if you look at some of the estimates coming out of Goldman Sachs, if you look at estimates coming out of the Brookings Institution, nonpartisan estimates, you do find a hit on growth simply because we need workers and now is not the best time to kick them out of our country.
So that could hasten the recession in the first year.
Yeah, I think the probability of recession goes up if you're talking about 60% tariffs on Chinese goods and if you're kicking millions of people out of the country.
Yeah, so it becomes a demographic consideration, right? The U.S. needs immigration to maintain its workforce.
Definitely.
All right, Ben, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Ben Harris back at the table. Don't be a stranger. Brookings Institution, former Assistant Treasury Secretary in the Biden administration, with his experience and view today in Washington.